that she'd like to make. Let me introduce our committee. So, who brings Sundays at 2 to you? Ernie Monshine is a member of the committee. He's not able to be here today. Sheila Stepko gave you your evaluations. Pat Tracy here, Sandy Toomey right here, and Bud Ward right over here. We could not do any of it without Shelley Robertson right here, who is our technical guru. She makes all of the magic happen. And Alice Cooper, who is the library director and member, ex officio member of our committee, that works with us very closely to bring these programs to you. So please be sure to take one of the flyers as you leave for the next season, the next session in our season. Also want to call to your attention the library raffle tickets. So the library's made, extended the Valentine's special, an extra drawing, and you get a Valentine's bag, goodie bag, if you buy a lottery ticket today. And those tickets will be available at the table right outside the room. So you can see from the sign here, grand prize $5,000, second prize $2,000, third prize $1,000, and some bonus drawings. And the best part is that it all contributes to the fabulous programs that we have here at the library. I also want to thank all of those who are watching today live on Facebook. One of the things that Shelley helps bring to life for us, that you can either watch it from home or later on you can watch it with your friends. So that's a good thing. And it'll be posted on the library's YouTube channel. So with that, Anne has an announcement that she'd like to make, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sandy to introduce our speaker. Anne?
And I'll be the lady selling the raffle tickets.
Yes.
Anne Muse, and I'm the president of the library board. And once again, we're doing our strategic planning. Oh, I'm a cafeteria
That's okay.
kind of person here. Once again, we're doing our strategic plan. We are just rounding out the year and beginning a new one with a different focus, primarily around empowering. Literacy is empowering. And so we're hoping to you'll see evidence of that in some of the programs that we're doing. But we need to hear from you. And so what we're doing is putting out surveys beginning February 18th and ending on March, I think it is 23rd. And the goal of that is to get your input, to hear your voice. It'll be about 15 questions, I believe, and they're a multiple choice, quick check kind of thing, and 2 open-ended questions. Sometimes you get the most information there from that. So please, when you see it, you'll see it on our Facebook page, and you'll even be able to get a copy of it at the front desk with a QR code. Please take the time to fill it out. Thank you very much. Oh, and teens, middle school, we're going to have ones available for you all as well, so that we can hear what your needs are for our new teen center. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, one to a household. Once you're into a household. So you both don't have to fill it out if you choose.
So I want to thank you all for coming to hear about the oyster holdings that are very close by. We kind of teased you. It is a hidden treasure, and it's right here on Gwynns Island. Some of you will remember the crab house that used to be off of Talon's Wharf Road. Well, now, just opposite that is the oyster holding. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to tell you a little bit about her. Our speaker actually came from the mountains. She grew up in Bedford, Pennsylvania, and has worked her way with the love of oysters all the way to our locality. She and her husband live in Tappahannock and have a 14-month-old Carson, which they juggle to accomplish two careers. Kasey grew up in the mountains, as I said, went to college, and through a professor who was doing restoration of a oyster bed on the Elizabeth River, came to find and love oysters. She has a biology background, so it was very fitting, and then she went on to BIMS to do an additional training. And now she manages the production, and she is a woman who can hold 63 million oysters in her hands. Any of you ever met that challenge? Without more ado, I'd like to introduce Kasey Balderson. Kasey.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I just want to give a round of applause, if we could, for the Sundays at 2 committee and for the Lancaster Library for having this event and hosting. All right, and I also just want to say thank you all for being here today. So, like Sandy said, my name is Kasey Balderson. I'm currently the hatchery manager for a company called Oyster Seed Holdings. We're a private commercial oyster hatchery on Glens Island, Virginia in Matthews County. And our primary job is to spawn adult oysters and then grow millions of baby seed oysters that we send to oyster farms up and down the East Coast. And so the oyster farmers get get the seed from our hatchery. They grow those seed out to a market-sized oyster. And those oysters are going to be destined for the half-shell market, so to be enjoyed on the half-shell in restaurants. And so the title of my presentation today is called From Spawn to Seed Inside an Oyster Hatchery. So the goal of my presentation is to kind of bring the hatchery to you all today through the screen and show you from start to finish how we make all these millions of baby oysters in hopes that you guys will maybe come and do an in-person tour with us later on this year. And so here's an aerial view of our hatchery. So we are that rectangle building there at the end of Callis Wharf Road on Glens Island. And the red circles out there out front are umbrellas. All right. So this is just an overview. Oops. Here we go. This is just an overview of what I want to talk about today. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of the oyster fishery here in the Chesapeake region. Because the history is truly what kind of led to the rise of aquaculture here in Virginia in the first place. Then we'll take a deep dive inside Oyster Seed Holdings, and I'm going to talk about all the different departments in the hatchery. So oysters are filter feeders throughout their entire life, so we have to grow microalgae for them. That's the food that they eat. Then I'm going to talk about broodstock, which are the parent oysters that we use to spawn with every single week. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the spawning process and how we do that. And then we're going to look at oyster larvae. So oysters actually swim for a period of their life for 2 weeks. At the end of that 2-week period, they go through a process called metamorphosis, in which they transfer from a free swimming stage to a sedentary stage, and then they become oyster spat or oyster seed, and this is our final product that we distribute out to the farms. And then I'm going to wrap up my presentation talking a little bit about advocacy and some efforts that Oyster Seed Holdings is involved in to kind of educate the public about oyster aquaculture to build community around our industry. All right, so just going to a little, I'm going to pop this off of here. Just going into a little bit of history of the oyster fishery here in Virginia. So oysters have been feeding people for thousands of years. So if we go back to the 15th century, this is when Native Americans inhabited Chesapeake Bay. And the word Chesapeake quite literally means Great Shellfish Bay, and that's exactly what Chesapeake Bay was. And the Native Americans ate a ton of oysters. They would spend a lot of their time in the summer months kind of hunter-gathering inland. But in the wintertime, they would move their camps closer to the coast, and oysters is what would sustain them in those colder winter months. And then if we jump ahead into the 1600s and 1700s, this is when we have colonization by the European settlers. Oysters were a very easy protein source for them, and I would argue that without oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, the colonists might have had a little bit of a harder time kind of transitioning over here. They would also eventually burn oyster shells and use them for mortar. And they would develop the hand tongs in the 1700s to make harvesting oysters a little bit more efficient. And oysters were very easy for them. It wasn't like an agricultural product like tobacco where you had to spend a lot of time cultivating them. You literally just had to go down, pick some oysters, and have enough grit to shuck them open. Then jumping ahead to the 1800s, this was kind of the true rise of the oyster fishery. So oysters were referred to as white gold during this time period. And oysters, everybody ate oysters, regardless of your social status. And I heard one time that it didn't matter if you were eating oysters, it was with what alcohol you were drinking with oysters, which kind of decided your social status. So if you were drinking a lager beer with your oysters, you were most likely in the poorer class, or a finer wine, you were most likely in the upper class there. And so the rise of the Industrial Revolution brought about a lot of different inventions that made harvesting oysters a little bit more efficient. And this really increased the demand of oysters at that time frame. So we have dredging and the skipjack, which is the boat that's pictured there in the top right. And you could fit 2 dredges off the back of a skipjack boat, and it could hold about 500 bushels of oysters off of the front of it. And then you also had the invention of canning. So canning was invented in France, but when it made its way back over here, that of course increased the shelf life of oysters. Then with the invention of the railroad, it could take that product more further inland. So the demand increased, and we weren't just enjoying them by the coast, we were enjoying them more into the heartland of the country. And so the demand really skyrocketed during this period. And so moving ahead, this was kind of a recipe of disaster here. So we had a high supply, a high demand, and then kind of an unregulated fishery. And so there were 4 major factors that kind of led to the decline of the oyster populations over time. The first of those was overharvesting. So in the 1880s, we saw the peak harvest of oysters in Chesapeake Bay at 20 million bushels every single year, which I just can't even believe that number. It's really unfathomable, and I would have loved to have seen just the oyster reefs at this time period and how expansive they were. So overharvesting was big. We were down to about 4 million when we go to like the 1930s. By the time we get to the early 2000s, we're down to about 20 to 30,000 bushels being harvested. So a pretty precipitous decline there over time. The second reason or factor was pollution. So with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, you have more people moving along the coast. This is going to increase your pollution. So we have a lot of kind of nutrient runoff with farming coming online there as well, and sedimentation. So if you already have a dredged oyster reef, it's very easy when you get sediment loaded into the bay there to smother out that very bottom layer of oyster reef. And a lot of coastal cities as well didn't have sewage until about the 1900s. So a lot of that sewage dumped right into our bay. The third was habitat loss, which is pretty self-explanatory. If we're removing a lot of these oysters from the bay, and those shells are not being put back, that's a limiting habitat for future generations of oysters to attach themselves to. Oysters like to set on other oyster shells. That's how they build that 3-dimensional reef structure. And then lastly, disease was kind of the final straw that wiped out any remaining oyster population. So we still have Dermo and MSX in Chesapeake Bay today. We just have a little bit of a better way of dealing with them in the aquaculture world. So these are parasitic protozoans. Dermo first pops up in the bay in 1949. MSX comes about 10 years later in the early 1960s and has pretty detrimental effects to adult oysters if they get infected with disease. And so this is just a graph showing that precipitous decline over time in number of oysters harvested. So we can see all the way on the left, in the 1880s, this was the record amount of oysters being harvested. And then, like I said, down in the 2000s, we're in that 20 to 30,000 bushel range being harvested. So it shows where Dermo pops up, and then MSX pops up, and then the red circle is where Dermo really kind of has its major effects. So Dermo was first found in 1949, but didn't really start killing oysters off until about the 1980s. And so we're kind of left with, well, what do we do now? Disease is absolutely ravishing our native oyster populations. And so we need a solution. We had this fishery that was once extremely prolific. It's almost near collapse at this point. And so scientists and politicians kind of got together to try to brainstorm where Virginia should go. And Virginia kind of wanted to go more towards the oyster cultivation route, but we first had to get over this hurdle of disease. We couldn't keep putting oysters out there and then they would keep dying because of dermo and MSX. So in 1997, Virginia's General Assembly appoints the Virginia Institute of Marine Science to develop a breeding program for oysters. And so the Aquaculture Genetics Breeding and Technology Center was born out of this. And basically what they did was they took a population of oysters and placed them in a disease-pressured environment, and then they bred the survivors, right? Because clearly there's something in them genetically that's allowing them to survive that disease. And as you keep doing this over time, you eventually attain a disease-resistant population. And so ABC is alive and well today. They were able to breed for disease resistance in oysters. And this is where hatcheries like Oyster Seed Holdings get our broodstock from. So VIMS still has this breeding program, and the purpose today, since they have achieved disease resistance, is to distribute these broodstock out to the hatcheries. And we spawn that broodstock and then sell the seed to our oyster farms. So our farmers can kind of rest assured that disease shouldn't be an issue that they're dealing with once the seed get out to their farm. And once disease resistance was initially achieved, they started breeding for other things such as a deep cup shape, high meat yield, fast growth. So some other characteristics that were really attractive to both market and then the end product in restaurants. And so this is kind of where Oyster Seed Holdings enters the picture. So our hatchery was born kind of out of a need for seed in the Chesapeake Bay region. And so, like I said earlier, we're a private commercial oyster hatchery, but we're also an independent hatchery, which just means that we don't have a farm component attached to the hatchery. We don't want to be competing with the oyster farms that we're trying to serve. So we'll probably always kind of remain that focus of just being a hatchery and distributing seed out to farms. We sell about 100 to 120 million now oyster seed every single year from Maine all the way to Florida. The size seed that we sell is 1 millimeter all the way up to just shy of a 1/4 inch. The picture there is about what 1 millimeter seed looks like, and just because we're not in the hatchery today, just to give you guys a comparison, they look very similar to cooked quinoa. If you guys are quinoa eaters, it looks strikingly similar to cooked quinoa. And then, like I said earlier, we're on Gwynns Island, Virginia. And so here's an aerial view of Gwynns Island. So we're that orange dot there at the end of Cowles Wharf Road on Milford Haven. And this picture is looking east. So the Chesapeake Bay is out on the horizon there. And the body of water that we're on is called Milford Haven. And then you can see the bridge that connects the mainland of Matthews County over onto the island there. The only stoplight in Matthews County is right there on that bridge. And then we're located kind of to the south of both the Piangatank and the Rappahannock rivers. All right, so our company basically has 3 main pillars that define who we are. The first of those is production, which I'm going to talk about today, as well as advocacy. But I wanted to at least mention our technology department, or our research and development department. So our technology department kind of has 3 main jobs. Technology and advocacy kind of work independently to support our overall goal of producing millions of baby oysters. But our tech department has 3 main goals. The first of those is developing hatchery technology. So Oyster Seed Holdings kind of seeks to be a leader in hatchery technology and developing and innovating systems that are not only going to increase our internal production, but kind of move the needle forward to advance the industry. And then problem solving, so any issue that we might run into in the hatchery in terms of production, if production isn't going how we'd like it to and we think something's going on, the technology department can kind of do some small scale experiments, take water quality samples to try to figure out what might be going on. And then collaboration, we also work a lot with other institutions, organizations, academia, to work on different projects. A lot of times academia needs an industry partner. We're happy to do that. And we also do a lot of grant writing and grant proposals for projects that we want to work on as well. All right, so getting into production and exactly how we produce all of our baby oysters, I just want to start with a brief overview of the oyster life cycle, just in case anybody isn't familiar. So this is kind of a depiction of how oysters reproduce in the wild. We kind of do it very similar in the hatchery, but just with a couple differences. So oysters are what we call broadcast spawners, which means that they release all of their eggs and all of their sperm at once into the water column. And hopefully by chance, those oyster eggs are going to fertilize. And once they do, they develop into what we call oyster larvae, which is the very first 2 weeks of an oyster's life. So they basically are these rudimentary free swimming creatures that are hanging out in the water column, filtering out algae cells. Until they reach the end of that 2-week time period, they become what we call petaveloger, which is this stage here. They're going to develop 2 different organs that kind of prepare them to go through that metamorphosis process when they go from a free swimming stage down to a sedentary stage. The first of those is an eye spot, which is a black spot on the outside of their shell there. That's a light sensing organ that orients that animal which way is up and which way is down. Of course, they want to swim down to the bottom because they're sedentary creatures. And then they're going to develop a foot, which we'll see a little bit later, that extends from outside of that shell. They can use that to feel around the bottom substrate to figure out where they want to strike for the rest of their life. Then once they've made that attachment, they're then just going to keep growing shell until they turn into an adult a couple years later, and the process starts all over again. So this is just a quick 3-minute video that's going to walk you through each department in the hatchery, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail about every department. So there might be an ad.
I want to know, have you made this mistake with your holster? And by mistake, I mean, did you get a holster that's uncomfortable so you don't carry all the time? You may.
Cool. All right, there we go.
My name is Mike Condrove. I'm majority owner of Oyster Seed Holdings. We are a shellfish hatchery company, and what we do is take adult oysters, spawn them, grow them through their complex life cycle until they're a little bit bigger and therefore more easily handled by oyster farmers. What we need to be able to do that are broodstock or adult oysters, oyster food, which is algae that we grow here on site for them, and then the oyster larvae that we make the baby oysters from. Out in the river, oysters really only spawn from about the beginning of June through the end of August. But here in the hatchery, we want to be spawning oysters from the beginning of January through the end of August. And so we have a broodstock room where we put our adult oysters, and we can trick them into thinking it's a different season than it actually is. And so we bring those oysters into the broodstock room, put them in tanks, adjust the water, so when they're in the broodstock room in November and December, they actually think that it's May or June and they're getting ready to spawn. And that way we can have oysters that are ready to spawn come January. In the hatchery, we have large vessels of bubbling colored fluids, which are microalgae. We grow those plants, millions and really trillions a day, that we can then feed to the animals. We feed those to broodstock, and we also feed them to the subsequent larvae and post-set oysters that come later in the process. So we have a broodstock that's ready to spawn. We have our feed that we feed our baby oysters, and now it's time to make those baby oysters. And so what we'll do is take our broodstock that are ready to spawn, bring them out onto the main floor and spawn them. We collect the eggs, fertilize those eggs, and put them into big tanks, big 4,500 liter tanks that sit out on the main production floor. The embryos develop into oyster larvae, and those oyster larvae start to swim around in the water and consume algae that we put in that water for them. That process goes on like that for about 2 weeks. Every other day we drain the larvae down, we collect them on screens so that we inspect them, make sure that they're eating well, make sure that they're healthy, clean the tanks that they've been in, refill those tanks with seawater, put the larvae back in the tanks, and feed them more feed. Oysters have this 2-part life cycle where they have a larval phase first and an adult phase second. They're a free-swimming larval oyster for the first 2 weeks of their life, and then they'll swim down to the bottom, find some substrate to attach to. Once that larval shell is glued in place, they'll go through metamorphosis where they lose the ability to swim, they rotate their internal organs 180 degrees and really maximize the size of the gill. Once we get them through that metamorphosis process out on the production floor, we basically have what you would normally think of as an oyster. They're just really, really small. And so we put them into some other systems to grow them increasingly bigger until they're more easily handled by farmers. We have oyster farmer customers that range from Rhode Island down to Florida, and we can pack the seed onto a screen and wrap them in wet paper towels and put them in a shipping container and send them overnight on UPS or FedEx truck, or people will come to the hatchery and pick that seed up. In a nutshell, that's what we do in the hatchery. That's how we take adult oysters, grow them through their two-part life cycle, and then get them into the hands of farmers so that they can then grow them out, and get them onto the dinner table, waterside picnic table, or whatever it might be for us to enjoy later.
Smart founders know something most people miss.
Go away. Okay, so that just gives you guys a little bit of kind of an overview into the hatchery. Now we'll kind of take each department and break it down into a little bit more detail. So first, going into algae. So like I said earlier, algae is the food that we feed all of our oysters. And so by their simplest definition, algae are unicellular marine plants. So being plants, they are photosynthesizers, which means that we have to provide them with all of those abiotic factors that they need in order to produce their own sugars. So sunlight, we mimic by the use of LED lights in the hatchery. We have to inject carbon dioxide into all of our culture vessels every so often. And then nutrients as well. So the density of algae cells that we're growing is much more concentrated than you would find out in seawater. So we have to add nutrients to all of our culture vessels in order for those cells to keep growing and dividing. And then of course, filtered seawater as well. And so we grow 4 different species of algae in the oyster hatchery. And it kind of sounds silly to say, but just like you and I, oysters require a very well-balanced diet in order to grow as healthy as they possibly can. And so each one of these species has its own different nutrient profile to it. And depending on what life stage in the hatchery that we're feeding, we can kind of customize a diet for that certain life stage to be able to give them a diet that's the healthiest for them. So for example, if we're feeding broodstock oysters, which we're trying to produce a lot of eggs out of those broodstock, we're going to feed them this nice green algae over here. It's our biggest size cell, and it's very full of fatty acids, which is good for egg production or egg development. All right, and then these are just a couple of pictures that shows the progression of different volumes of algae that we grow. So we start with teeny tiny volumes of algae over here in that top left corner. So these are what we call our starter cultures, which a lot of people like to compare to sourdough starter cultures, which it's kind of very similar. This is kind of like our inventory of algae species that we have in the hatchery. And then when we're ready to try to actively grow those species, we take a small sample from that flask and put it into one of these 1 liter aerated flasks. And then they'll grow for 5 days. So those cells just grow exponentially in those flasks. Oops, I'm sorry, guys. Until they run out of resources, and then they need to go into a larger volumed flask. So one of the 1 liters will go into a 4 liter. That will grow again for 5 days, and then it can be transferred into a larger volume. So that's kind of how we scale up our algae production until we get tanks like these that are 1,400 liters apiece. And so our algae, and this isn't even really half of it, we have a whole nother algae wing in the hatchery. We produce 7,000 liters a day of algae or so in the hatchery. So we have lots of mouths to feed, so we have to produce a lot of food. Okay, so moving on to broodstock. So these are our parent oysters that we use to spawn with. And so like Mike said in the video, our production season is from January all the way through August. So we have to have oysters that are ripe and ready to spawn from January to August. So how we do that is in our broodstock room. We have 12 of these tanks, And we have to make it feel like it's summertime in there for these oysters, because oysters typically spawn twice a year, once in June and once about August. And so we warm the temperature of the water up in there to about 74 degrees. Then we feed them all of that cultured algae food that we've been growing. And after about 6 to 8 weeks, those oysters are going to be ready to spawn. So this is the goal of our broodstock room. This is what we want our oysters to look like at the end of that time period. All of this material here, this is a female oyster. All of that is eggs. And so that's what we want to be able to make all these millions of baby oysters. And oysters are what I like to call reproductive powerhouses. A single female can produce up to 100 million eggs in a spawning season. So really pretty incredible. And as you can see, 80% of the body mass of that oyster is just housing gametes for that spawning process. All right, so now going into spawning. So in the oyster aquaculture world, we're primarily focused with growing what we call triploid oysters. So diploid oysters are oysters that have 2 sets of chromosomes that are out in the wild. You and I are diploid organisms. We have 2 sets of chromosomes, one from mom and one from dad. But like I said, we're kind of more geared toward growing triploids, which have 3 sets of chromosomes. And the reason that is beneficial for our farms is because that makes the oysters sterile. So why does that matter? Being sterile means that they're not putting any energy into reproducing. So they're putting all of that energy into meat weight. So the oysters can be sold all year round, including the summertime when the natural diploids are spawning. So it increases that time frame. And they also grow a lot faster than a natural diploid would. So a diploid gets to market size in about 2 to 3 years. Triploids about 18 months. So you can see there in the photo, these oysters are the same age, and the triploids are that much further ahead than the diploids. So, and triploids they're non-GMO. This is something that can happen in nature. It's very rare, but the aquaculture world is kind of capitalizing on this rarity because it gives us these 2 benefits. All right, and so every single week when we go to spawn, we have to do a specific cross that is going to get us these triploid oysters. So we take diploid females and mate them with tetraploid males, which is an oyster that has 4 sets of chromosomes. So to do some simple math here, each parent is going to donate half of its genetic material. So when they do that, the diploid's going to donate half, which is 1 set of chromosomes. The tetra's going to donate half, which is 2. That's how you end up with a triploid oyster that has 3 sets of chromosomes. All right, so this kind of depicts the spawning process. So first we have to identify males and females. You can't do that by looking at an oyster. There is kind of a general rule. Oysters typically start out their life as males, and they turn into females later on in their life when they get larger. So you can kind of use that as a rule that smaller ones are most likely males and larger ones are most likely females. But you have to shuck that oyster open and take a sample of the gonad to be able to see if it's eggs or sperm. Then we have to collect the eggs in a process that we call strip spawning, which is just taking a scalpel and gently removing the eggs from those females into a solo cup. You guys might not ever look at a solo cup the same way. And then we have to isolate the eggs. So sometimes during that strip spawning process, you get other bits of tissue in there. So we just run those eggs over a screen to remove those tissues, to isolate them, and then they get fertilized with a little bit of that tetraploid sperm. Then once we start seeing those eggs start to divide, we put them in these large 4,700 liter tanks out on the main production floor. This is what dividing oyster eggs look like. And then hopefully the next morning when we come into the hatchery, we have millions of baby larval oysters swimming around in those tanks. And that's what we hopefully see the day after we do a spawn. These are what we call D-shape oyster larvae. The name is very fitting because they look like the capital letter D. And then this is what they look like after 8 days. So after we feed them algae every single day, you can just see the difference in how much shell growth they put on. And then 12 days, that's what they look like with that foot that I was talking about earlier, how it kind of extends from outside of the shell So all of those larvae are kind of feeling around the bottom or trying to find a place to attach themselves to. Then they're going to go through metamorphosis, and that's what they look like at the end. So they lose their ability to swim, they maximize the size of the gill structure there, and then now they're just filtering algae particles and getting more shell to grow into adults. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about what we have to do on our end to care for oyster larvae. So this is my job in the hatchery, and we have to do water changes on any tank that contains oyster larvae every other day. So we have to keep that seawater clean in there so the waste products don't build up. And then we have to grade them. So once we do our water changes and the larvae are outside of their tank, we run them through a series of screens to separate the big guys out from the smaller guys. Because when we restock them back into the tank, we don't want the bigger ones out competing the smaller ones. So then we put them in buckets by size, and then we count them. So people are like, well, how do you count them? You do 1, 2, 3. That would take forever. We do just a method of self-sampling, which we take micropipette. We put them into those buckets and just evenly distribute the larvae in the buckets, take 3 samples. We can count how many is in those samples and then scale up the math to figure out how many is in our bucket. And then we restock them back into our tanks and they continue to grow. All right, so talking about oyster seed now. So these are the systems that we use to grow all of our oyster seed. These are called bottle upwellers. And their name is very fitting. All of these are what we call bottles, and our oyster seed sits in the bottles. And then upwellers, we've got seawater and algae that's being mixed through, it's being mixed through the bottom manifold there, that's going up through each bottle. And it's really just fluidizing that seed bed in there. And so the seed are just tumbling. They come out of these bottles looking nice and pretty because they're chipping off any irregular shell growth in there just by fluidizing. And then we're feeding them lots of algae that we've been growing in the hatchery. We have 5 different ones of these systems that progressively grow seed to larger sizes in the hatchery. So we typically get them to about 1 millimeter, which is our smallest selling size in the hatchery, before they go to our outside nursery. So this is just what that bottle looks like, kind of an up-close view if you guys can see there. That seed bed is just kind of turning over, and that's what they look like under the microscope at that point. Anybody want to guess how many seed is in that system right there? A lot. A lot. There's about 20 million just in that kind of frame there. Pretty incredible. All right, so the nursery is where the final grow out of our oysters occurs. So this is from April through September. So kind of right now is our most stressful year in the hatchery, stressful time of year, because we're stockpiling 1 millimeter seed in the hatchery, but we can't send them outside yet because it's way too cold. So we anxiously await until April comes around when the water temperature warms up to start kicking these seed outside, so that Mother Nature can kind of help take care of them at this point. And so these are what we call upweller tanks. They act very similarly to those bottle upwellers, and then all the seed is split between those silos there. And then the water from Milford Haven is being pumped into the tank, and then the water upwells up through the bottom of those screens, so it's delivering natural algae that Mother Nature is producing to that seed bed, and then it's exiting through the top right back out to Milford Haven and just recirculates. So thankfully we don't have to grow the food for these guys anymore, so it's a little bit of a relief when the seed go outside into the nursery. And this is a picture about the biggest size seed that we sell here. All right, so just like larvae, we have to grade all of our seed too. We keep sizes separate, so we grade about twice a week. That just really helps those young ones to be able to get enough resources and not be outcompeted by the older ones. And this is our final product. So if we're sending a seed somewhere that's not local, we wrap them up in this landscape cloth that you can just get from Lowe's. We put them in a cooler that's got some ice packs in it, and then it could be in Maine by the next day, or Florida the next day, or any other state that we can't easily get to, or the farmer has to come to us. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about one of our other pillars of our company, which is advocacy, and some efforts that we're involved in to kind of educate the public about oyster aquaculture and all of its benefits. So we kind of realized a couple of years ago that there was just kind of this general lack of public knowledge about oyster hatcheries and oyster, mostly oyster hatcheries, but kind of aquaculture too. But we wanted to kind of connect this loop here from the consumer to the hatchery. And we just wanted to share all of the many ecological benefits that oysters provide to the bay. So I was telling you guys earlier, I could spend a whole nother presentation just talking about the ecological benefits, but oysters are filter feeders, so they clean our bay. The common statistic is that a single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. They're keystone species, which just means that oysters or other economically important species in our bay, like blue crab, striped bass, they all rely on oyster reefs for their survival. And then the reefs are also habitat for 300 plus other organisms, but not just oyster reefs. The cages that our farmers use to grow their oysters are also habitat for small juvenile fish and crabs to kind of hide in. Oysters also sequester carbon and excess nutrients from the waterways too, so still kind of helping clean up the bay. And then shellfish farming is one of the only net positive farmed protein. So that just means that shellfish farming is actually good for the environment. So we just felt like it was kind of our responsibility to leverage the hatchery to build support and kind of educate others about what we do. And so through a grant by the Chesapeake Oyster Alliance, we started hatchery tours and tastings to the public. So we would offer 6 different tour slots on Friday afternoons, and we would take groups of 6 people through the hatchery, and at the end they would get a tasting of 3 oysters and 3 wines. And we had a lot of fun doing it. We started it with just a pop-up tent, which you can see in the top left picture there. Basically a pop-up tent and a couple of staff who were willing to stay after work on a Friday to give these tours. We sold 2,500 oysters, or we didn't sell, but we did the tasting. So 2,500 oysters were enjoyed. It was a great success. We had a lot of fun doing it, and I think a lot of people learned a lot about oysters and about the hatchery. But in 2023, we decided to take that up a notch and replace our pop-up tent with a food truck. So dress it up a little bit, and we still continued the public tours, and we kind of partnered with a featured farm every week. So we would reach out to a farmer that we sold seed to, and they would give oysters back to the hatchery. We could kind of feature their farm from the hatchery. And so the food truck is called the Hatchery. It's kind of confusing. I don't know if that was smart or not, but anyway. So we sell basically oyster-centric themes from it, or dishes from it. So raw and roasted dozens, fried oyster basket, oyster po' boys, things like that. We do have a couple menu options for people who don't eat oysters, but we certainly encourage people to at least try them. And then in 2024, we added boat tours as well. So you could take a tour of the hatchery and then immediately hop on a boat and go look at some local farms around the Piankatank and Milford Haven. So we partnered with Trey Sowers at Matthews Dead Rise Charters. And this was just really cool because it gives people a full circle experience of the entire process. So where oysters get their start in the hatchery, all the way up to how they're grown on the farm, and then you get to come and eat oysters afterwards. So just a really cool full circle experience for people. And then, like I said, we still did our tours last year in 2024 or 2025. We continue to do those this year as well. So formal invitation for you guys to come, and I'll give you a personal tour myself of the hatchery. And then here's just a little bit of a gallery view of kind of what a Friday afternoon or Saturday afternoon looks like at the hatchery. We have a wonderful office view, so this is what I get to look at every single day working at the hatchery. It's absolutely beautiful. So we would love for you guys to come and hang out with us on a Friday or Saturday afternoon. So this is our team. I just wanted to show the faces of Oyster Seed Holdings. I'm really lucky that I get to work with these group of people who are so passionate about this industry and what they do. And it's definitely something that you have to be passionate about because oysters require weekend work, they require holiday work. So it's definitely something that you have to love what you do, and I can say that we all definitely do. And then with that, I'll take a couple questions. Like I said earlier, thank you guys so much for coming.
Before Kasey starts with questions and answers, how many of you were aware of this hidden treasure on Gwyn's Island?
How cool. Have any of you guys been?
And how many have been there?
Awesome. Cool. At least we
And how many would like to go there?
Yeah. So we need still working? Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Could I buy oyster seed from you, or do you only sell commercial?
That's a great question. So kind of our minimum seed order is about 10,000, but we do an event every year. For any extra seed that we grow, we have an event for hobby oyster farmers who can come and purchase those seed that are kind of extra hanging around in the hatchery. So
How would I know when you're doing that?
we typically advertise that on social media. I can get your email too if you want, if you're interested after that, and I can let you know when we're doing that event. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Do you only produce and sell triploid, or do you also produce diploid?
Great question. So it's about I would say a 90-10 split. So 90% of our production is triploid. That's just because that's where the demand is. A lot of our oyster farmers prefer those triploid oysters, but we absolutely produce diploids as well. And a lot of the diploids that we produce, we sell as eyed larvae. To do like spat on shell oyster restoration efforts. So we'll send oyster eyed larvae to like Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Oyster Recovery Partnership, and then they'll set those eyed larvae in these massive tanks that have oyster shell in them. And then once they set on those shells, they'll take those shells out and put them on the reefs for restoration efforts. But yes, we do produce diploids.
And so is the population, the natural, not the farming population,
Yeah.
the natural population today increasing, decreasing?
It is getting better. So unfortunately, I don't ever think that we'll be where we were, by the time the colonists were here. But in 2023, I believe, we pulled in the highest amount of oysters in 35 years. Which is good, and I think VMRC extended the oyster harvesting time. So it was about 300,000 bushels that were harvested on, that wild harvest were being harvested. 400,000 of those were aquacultured. So it is increasing, yes. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. One's pretty simple and one won't be.
Okay.
You say you have 4 species you produce. Do they have different tastes?
So we grow all of the same species. So Chrysostrea virginica, the eastern oyster, we're only producing 1 oyster species. We grow 4 different species of algae.
Sorry.
Right.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And the other thing is you are essentially breeding these oysters seed in warm water.
Mm-hmm.
And they ship as far as you said, Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Which is not warm water.
Right.
How does that all work out?
Yeah. So that's a great.
Rhode Island water is not as cold as, say, May.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so what we try to do when we're sending oysters to a different location than where we're coming from, we always ask the farmer. Salinity is another big one. So if different salinity areas, that's not great either. And what we'll do is acclimate those seed before we send them out to the farm. So we kind of try to match those parameters before they go into the environments that they're going to be grown in to give them an easier kind of transition time before they get to the farm.
Thank you.
Kasey,
Yes.
this is two questions. The first one is reference the boat tour,
Uh-huh.
and the wine. Is that April to?
Yes, and I think
August or
it's
September?
April. I think this year we're doing it a little bit different, and I might have to circle back with you on that one. I think it's April through the end of July this year.
Okay.
August can be a tricky time for production in the hatchery because it gets very, very hot. Oysters don't like that.
And my second question, have schools come to you?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Lancaster schools?
Yes, well, I don't know if Lancaster has.
Uh-huh.
Chesapeake Bay Governor School certainly has. Some elementary schools have. But we are definitely open for any school groups. I just ask that you kind of reach out to us and schedule it kind of well in advance. But yes, we can plan that.
What's the minimum size or maximum size?
We try to accommodate kind of whatever you can do.
Class size, maybe.
Yeah, 20 would be great. We would probably have to split that in between two different staff members to tackle that group, but we'll do what we can to make that work. Yeah, yes, sir.
See if this works. Yeah, there we go. So for our home oyster growing, if we're getting triploids, by definition, are we getting something that is dermo and MXS resistant?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say that Oyster Seed Holdings, like I said, we get all of our broodstock from Virginia Institute of Marine Science. All of the oysters that they give to us are disease resistant. So that means that when we spawn those adult oysters, it's very, very likely that the seed that we're giving to farms are also disease resistant.
And the second question is, was it the over-harvesting that led to those diseases in the first place? Like the lack of filtering of the bay?
It very well could be. That's an excellent question. It certainly doesn't make it any easier. Disease really likes different environmental conditions. So when we have droughts and the salinity increases, that's where diseases thrive. In the 1980s, when dermo really had that major impact, we had a drought in the Chesapeake Bay during that time. So environment plays a big role in there too. Disease tends to harness itself in animals like just after spawning when they're really, really weak. So over-harvesting could have done it, but I would say probably maybe more environmental factors. Got it.
I had a couple of questions about the viruses too. If you're doing your own harvesting, how do you know if an oyster's got the virus? Are there visible signs? And then the second question is that bad for the person that consumes the oyster as well as for the oyster?
Yeah, so it is not harmful to humans. If dermo or MSX is in an oyster, you are not going to get sick from eating them, so you don't have to worry about that. What was your first question?
Oh, just how you can tell if they have them, or if the oysters that are readily available that you buy, I mean, are they all going to be disease-free, or, you know?
Yeah, so you can tell if an oyster, if you're growing oysters at your home and a lot of them are starting to die, there's a warning sign that something's going on. Disease could be a possible factor, but to know for sure, you would have to send a sample of those oysters to a disease pathology lab, which we do at the hatchery regularly. To sell seed to different states, you have to have a clean pathology report on them. So that's something that you could do. But it could be a lot of different factors if you start noticing that your oysters are starting to die. It could be a harmful algae bloom that's causing them to get sick. So you would have to get them tested to do that. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, so when you're actually cleaning, because there's a lot of cleaning that goes on.
There's a lot of cleaning that goes on.
So the product that is the waste product, where does it go? Is there something good that happens with that waste product?
Yeah, so oysters really don't produce a ton of waste, especially larval oysters, which we're growing in the hatchery. It is minuscule. So we're not like fish hatcheries where you've got all of this waste that you're just offloading back into the water. Oyster hatcheries are not that way, and there's nothing regulatory that kind of makes us have to deal with those waste products because it's minuscule. Yes, sir.
You said that when you send out the seed oysters, that size, that these guys put them on oyster shells or something like that. So you can't just go and spread these out in the water and they'll survive? They have to be on a reef or something?
Yeah. So you can't take individual single seed and just throw them out there because they will most likely get smothered in the mud. You can take, and what a lot of companies do is purchase them as eyed larvae from us. So that period, that video where the larvae had their foot out and they were kind of exploring, people can buy those from us. And they set them in these big tanks with oyster shell in them, and those eyed larvae attached to the shells. Then you can take those shells and then place them out on reefs for different companies who are doing restoration. That's the way that works. It's very hard to just take seed and scatter them and expect them to live because they'll sink.
Those tanks, are they circulating the water?
Yes.
Feeding them?
Yes. Yep, so those tanks are basically hooked up to whatever body of water they're on. A pump pumps water to that tank. The tank has aeration for the larvae. Once they make that attachment after several days, then that shell gets planted out onto the reef, restoration reef. Yes, sir, in the back.
What if the body of water that the oysters are growing in is polluted? And I don't mean the dermal and the other one you mentioned, but things like E. coli and what have you. A lot of Carter's Creek around here is very well polluted. Can you eat those oysters?
So I would not suggest eating those oysters, but Shellfish Sanitation, the Department of Shellfish Sanitation, Virginia Department of Health, do water quality monitoring in all the different tributaries around the bay, and they mark which areas are closed for oyster harvesting and which are okay for oyster harvesting. So certainly look at that map to figure out where you can harvest oysters from and where you cannot. If you're in a location where you cannot harvest oysters, please do not do so because of that reason, for sure. Yes, ma'am.
There's a website where that map is posted, but I can't remember what it is. Can you tell us where it was?
It's probably on the Virginia Department of Health or Shellfish Sanitation.
Okay.
I heard that you're not supposed to eat oysters that are really close to the shore. Is that because they're just not getting enough circulation, or is it more disease?
It could be for pollutant reasons. If they maybe are exposed at low tide a lot, especially in the summertime, you don't want to do that because Vibrio bacteria could proliferate in them. So that would be my reason, maybe why not to.
So to dovetail on the previous question back there, if you're growing your oysters in a restricted area, I've heard that you can then move them to an open area.
Yeah.
And in a pretty finite period of time,
Yep.
they'll flush out.
Yep, they can purge for a set number of days, I think, which is recommended by one of those two agencies to be able to flush out, and then they can be safe for harvesting. Yes, sir.
These oyster harvesters that have a permit to harvest oysters, are they also required to reseed the bed that they're harvesting on?
So there are public and private oyster beds. The public oyster beds, the state of Virginia does a lot of that maintenance. But if you're in it for the private, I would think that farmer would want to do that, right? So that he can keep harvesting from that lease that he has. But the state of Virginia does a lot of the maintenance for the public grounds. So, sending shell overboard as substrate for future generations to attach to and things of that nature. So I don't think it's required, but I think they probably do that anyway.
You mentioned earlier that 90% of the oysters you grow are triploids. Is there a coming business for the diploids? I mean, if we want to keep the bay healthy.
Sure, yeah, so that's kind of where the restoration companies come into play. So we're mostly centered on providing seed to our farmers to keep the restaurants full and supplied with oysters, but there are several restoration companies who are focused on getting those diploids, which, like I said, we do provide, and kind of helping our natural populations come back that way. But in terms of the aquaculture market, triploids are definitely the highest in demand. In the Northeast, diploids tend to grow a little bit better than triploids do. So a lot of diploids are produced up there.
So lastly, would you like to tell people how they schedule a tour?
Sure, yeah. So you can go to www.oshoyster.com and click on the visit link. And then we should have, I don't think they're up yet, but soon we're going to have our tours come live. And you just book a slot for however many people you want. Typically, we like to keep 6 people per oyster tour. Just so we don't get overcrowded and you can kind of have an intimate experience looking at the systems and talking with a staff member who's taking you around. But yeah, you can just kind of watch our social media. We're on Facebook and also Instagram, and we announce when those tours are going to be on both of those platforms. So just keep an eye out.
And I can tell you they fill up very quickly, so be on the lookout. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.